Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Julia Rothkopf, and I'm the Program Associate at YIVO. Today, we have editors Nancy Sinkoff, Jonathan Karp, James Leffler, and Howard Lubavitch joining us for a discussion about the recently published volume, A Jew in the Street, New Perspectives on European Jewish History. For those of you who do not know YIVO, we are a very special place for the celebration, contemplation, and exploration of Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish culture. We are located in New York City, where our library and archive contain over 24 million documents and 400,000 books, and these resources are used by researchers from all around the world. We have lots of classes on Yiddish language and culture, exhibitions, and public programs just like this one, where we aim to bridge the worlds of Jewish culture and our vast library and archival collections. So today we have the editors of the series of the volume joining us. So we have Nancy Sinkoff, who is the academic director of the Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and professor of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers, New Brunswick. We have Jonathan Karp joining us. He is the professor of Judaic Studies and History at Binghamton University of the State University of New York. James Leffler is the Felix Posen Professor of Jewish History at Johns Hopkins University, and Howard Lubavitch is Professor of History and Director of the Cohen-Haddo Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State University. So thank you all for joining, and I will turn it over to Jim.
Hi there. I hope you all can hear me. I am in New York, in a not as quiet place as I would hope, but I'm very excited to be here and welcome all of you to our conversation about this book, A Jew in the Street. So the four of us began working on this volume some time ago because we really wanted to create a tribute to Michael Stanislawski, with whom we studied. And as you'll hear about today, someone who has really transformed the field of modern Jewish historiography, the study of Eastern Europe, the study of Jewish Eastern Europe, and many of the themes directly connected to YIVO. What we're going to do is have a conversation in which individuals are going to kind of pick up certain themes to focus on key aspects of this book and what it is, and also to use it as an opportunity to think about what is the endeavor of writing East European Jewish history and East Central and European Jewish history more broadly in this moment. What has it meant for scholars of our vintage who are thinking about the questions of the past and how it intersects with the present, and what it means also for the profession of history. And history writing. How do we train students in universities? How do we think about what we have inherited from the past through Michael Stanislawski, about whom you'll hear a lot today, and through the texts, right? The texts and memories we've received. In that spirit, I want to say a quick word of opening about the title, A Jew in the Street. We take and still is in some one of the most important known poems in Jewish Europe. And it's a poem that gives us this image that's defined so much of what we think about when it comes to Jews and politics, Jews and modernity, Jews and liberalism, and Jews in Europe. And that is the phrase to be a man in the street and a Jew in the home. That's an image that suggests that what Jewishness is a kind of accommodation with modernity. It's a kind of restricting Jewish identity to the private sphere of life, to religious sphere, and out in the street, you're neutral, right? It's also a male image, right, about what it means to be a Jew in the modern world and what kind of imagined person is the citizen at the center of this drama. It's also an image and a poem quote that is widely misunderstood. And even though it defines so much of how people shorthand talk about balancing identity, right? Balancing modernity and tradition, balancing being Jewish and universal. It's an image which is misunderstood and was misunderstood until Michael Stanislawski, writing in 19th century Russia, Yod Lamed Gordon, what it was meant by that, and what was a challenge to actually, and an image that you had to choose. We'll say a little bit more about this, but we chose to rework the phrase in our title of our book because we felt in so many ways Stanislawski's work is a challenge to those images and an interrogation of these categories that we work with. And I don't just mean we as scholars work with, that we work with when we think about who we are in the world and when we think about the European Jewish past. The idea that there was a hard split between what Jews could do inside versus outside, the idea that they had to choose, the idea that also languages were kind of binary. You spoke X or you spoke Y. All of these things we learned through his work and continue to learn are received wisdom and also myths. And what we experienced as graduate students text, even the most powerful images and shorthand symbols that we have, let's not take them at face value. And so let's realize that the Jew goes into the street. Let's realize that, in fact, the construction of modern Jewish politics and the things we live with today and wrestle with, Zionism, the legacy of socialism, the question of liberalism, all of these were invented in a Europe that was struggling with the Jew and with which the Jew is struggling. So that's kind of an overview of where we're going in our conversation today. And I want to now turn it over to Nancy Sinkoff. I'm going to ask Nancy to speak particularly about this question of Michael Stanislawski, the Jew in the Street, and YIVO, which is an institution that's sponsoring our event and which is a institution that is built out of that very moment. And it's an institution that in which, as we'll learn, Michael Stanislawski played a huge role and which played a huge role in his development as a scholar.
Thanks so much, Jim. There's been a little bit glitchy stuff with the internet. So I want to make sure, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. I'm also zooming in from New York, but further north than Jim. I think he's in the city. So I'm going to just, if you don't mind, Jim, I'm going to just repeat a couple of things that I think people maybe didn't hear. So the first is that the title of Jew in the Street is our flipping a very famous poem by Yalag, Yud Lamed Gordon, about whom Michael Stanislawski wrote a really magisterial biography, For Whom Do I Toil? And the poem, the phrase comes from a very, very famous poem called Hekitza Ami, Wake Up My People. And in it you have this phrase about being a Jew at home and a man in the street. And what Jim noted, and maybe you didn't hear, is that Michael Stanislawski unpacked the mythology about this binary, particularly for East European Jewry, that the binary about the privatization and the confessionalization of Jewish identity and the public citizenship or entering or culturation into the public sphere was a West European idea. And that when you look at East European Jewish history, and by East European, we mean the lands of Poland, Lithuania, and then everything that happens after the 18th century, and the descendants of East European Jews, which we are reminded comprised between 75 and 80% of world Jewry, that in fact, those categories, that bifurcation did not work. And we all inherited that understanding as we worked on Eastern Europe and East Central Europe. Howard is a Hungarianist, I want you to be clear. And both John and I and Jim have written also in the US. So, and that's another issue, is the geographic borders between what the heck is Eastern Europe? And that, as many of us know, was a Cold War construct, right? And Michael Stanislawski was reared and raised and taught us in the context of the Cold War, but then all of us now experienced what it meant when the wall fell down, right? After 1991. I want to give credit to the Polish Roundtable. Everyone always credits Berlin, but the Polish Roundtable happened first. So that was what Jim said at the beginning. And that is what we did. That is why we wanted to do the book. We wanted to honor Michael, but we also wanted to reflect on our generation, vintage, I love that, how we see the world now as historians. How do we train our students? The assumptions that Michael was working with, lack of archival access, and other things has really changed for us. And also, I would say the really fructifying conversation we can now have with East European scholars, with scholars based in Eastern Europe. It's very different than when it was before 1991. And there are lots of stories we can tell about that. So sorry, Jim, I just wanted to make sure that people heard actually what you said, because the introduction that you and John wrote for the book is really illuminates these historiographic and methodological issues that we inherited from Michael Stanislawski. So my task is a little more YIVO-centric, and I'm happy for it to be, because I personally have been associated with YIVO since 1981. I was really younger than I am now, and I've had a long and very fruitful and continue to have a long and fruitful relationship with the YIVO. And so I'm happy to talk about it vis-a-vis Michael Stanislawski. Now, those of you who know Michael Stanislawski personally know that he's not an institutional cheerleader. It's just not his temperament. I'll hold the pom-poms. But the book, A Jew in the Street, New Perspectives on European Jewish History, bears the imprint of the significance of the YIVO Institute, both on his scholarship and on ours, and on the contributors to the volume. I did ask Michael to give me a little backstory about his own encounter with the YIVO. Michael Stanislawski is Montreal born. So that's important, because the YIVO that he encountered in New York was part of what's called the Amuptal, the American division of the YIVO that was founded. It was founded in Berlin, but its building was in Vilna, importantly. So he told me that when he first entered what many of us refer to as the old YIVO, and that's the YIVO when it was now, it was 86th Street and 5th Avenue, what is now the Lauder Museum of Austrian Art. He entered in 1971, and he attended the Oriol Weinreich Sommerprogramm of Yiddish Literatur und Kultur. And back in the day, that was really the program. And now we have Yiddish programs really all over the world, right? We have them in Europe, we have them in Israel and Tel Aviv. We have one in Oxford, we had one briefly, I think, in Vilnius. I think it's not there anymore. And of course, YIVO still runs the Weinreich Sommerprogramm. But Michael took it in 1971. And he remembers the legendary director, Shmuel Lapin, who was always talked about with glowing terms. He died prematurely, but his late wife, who only recently died, she lived forever, and she was an extraordinary Chava Lapin, she was my Yiddish teacher and an incredible Yiddish teacher, and an incredible person. She was a biochemist in her spare time, besides teaching hundreds of students Yiddish. He also remembers, again, a legend, Hannah Frischdorf. And I urge all of you out there listening, Google Hannah Frischdorf, Warsaw Ghetto, and you can see this extraordinary picture of Hannah as a young woman on the ruins of Warsaw after the German destruction. And then when the Soviets were on the other side of the Vistula, just watching it happen. And Hannah was a survivor of the ghetto uprising, and she worked at the old YIVO. And when you walked into that building in those days, and Michael experienced it, and I'm old enough to have experienced it myself, you were encountering refugee historians, refugee activists, East European Jews for whom Yiddish was a mother tongue. And who actually had the identity, that non-bifurcated identity that Michael interrogated in his work, and which is so different than the way American Jews perceive of Jewish identity. So he became a regular, he told me, at YIVO during graduate school. And Michael studied, by the way, at Harvard with our teacher, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, and others. And he also befriended, again, a bit of a legend, Lucien Dobrzycki, who was a survivor of the Łódź Ghetto and Auschwitz. And Lucien lived in Poland after the war. That's an extraordinary 1945 to 1950, looking at the survivor historians who tried to make a life for themselves in the aftermath, and then many left. And then he immigrated to the United States in 1970. That's Lucien Dobrzycki. And Michael became very close to Lucien, and who, like Hannah Frischdorf and others, was part of that extraordinary refugee scholarly community at YIVO in those years. Lucien's widow, Felicia, still works as a Slavic bibliographer at Columbia. So Michael has the chance to see her. And he recently found out, and he told me this, so I'm communicating it, that one of their twin sons is named Lucien Dobrzycki, which is kind of amazing to think about that. At the YIVO, Michael was also friendly with the redoubtable librarian, Dina Abramovich, who, again, legendary. She was like a cherub. And if you know what a cherub is, they're not sweet. A cherub is an attack dog that sits on the guarding the Aron Kodesh. And Dina was little, and you thought, oh, she's a nice old lady. No, not true. She really wouldn't let you into the archives unless she thought you were serious. If you were there for like, oh, I want to hear about my grandmother who was a horse trader, she was like, yeah, I've heard 40,000 stories like that. I'm really not interested. Go away. But if you were willing to sit in the unair conditioned sweat of the summer or the freezing cold winter in the old YIVO, Dina would take you seriously. And so she clearly took Michael seriously, and I ultimately won her affections. It took a long time. Dina was born in Vilna, and she was a librarian at the Jewish Public Library in Vilna. So again, the point of these anecdotes is that this is the world that Michael Stanislawski encountered as a young scholar, and it had deep, deep meaning. It couldn't but have deep meaning because the life experience of the people at the YIVO day was conveyed in just the way they were, right? They knew everything in some ways in their bones, and then they were professionals too. When he was first hired at Columbia, in 1980, he acquired a second office in the old YIVO building. I don't know how he figured that one out, but maybe, I don't know, Shmuel Lapin gave it to him. And he said he used it sporadically, quote, in candor, since it was very close to Lucien's office. I spent most of my time there chatting with him. So there you go. But I do want to say something, when you chat with people, you learn a lot of things, and they often give you bibliographic suggestions in what I would call the derech agav. Like they just tell you things and you go, oh, I never thought about that. I better go check that. I'm an idiot. I didn't think about that. And I'm sure Lucien gave Michael pearls. Lucien Dobrzycki, you may know, did the incredible book exhibition, Image Before My Eyes, with the incredible, sorry, these people are incredible, Barbara Kirschen-Black Gimlet, who became the executive curator of the Polin Museum, and Image Before My Eyes. And that movie, which is now very long for us, with our no attention spans, is an incredible film because it shows the multilinguistic, the polyglot nature of modern Jewish life in Eastern Europe. And he also knew Bina Weinreich, Uriel Weinreich's daughter-in-law, who was a very extraordinary folklorist and who had been married to Uriel Weinreich, Max Weinreich's son, who died again prematurely. So that's the personal with Michael. But the book's debt to YIVO was quite substantial, beginning with the cover image. And I actually, the book is in a different room right here. So if anyone has it, but if John, maybe you can hold it up. So lest you think we're not visual, the four of us worked really hard on this book's cover, and Wayne State was fantastic. So a shout out to them. You'll notice there are two images. And one has a traditional Jewish man walking on the street next to a young girl. And that shows the gender problem, or how to think of modernity wasn't just a male phenomenon. And then the other image, which we got from the Ghetto Fighters archive in Israel, shows a lonely Jew on the street. And that image extends to the spine. Yeah. So the first image of the man and the woman comes from YIVO. Comes from the YIVO archive. So again, YIVO is not merely a repository of text, but also it's a repository of material culture, video, and images. And they're very, very important for us as scholars, particularly when you learn how to read, if you will, a visual image. But the book has other debts. I went through our book. I mean, of course, I read every word beforehand, but I went through for this talk citations to see where YIVO was mentioned. And the YIVO Encyclopedia of the Jews of Eastern Europe, a project of extraordinary impact, edited by the late Gerson Hundert, and engaging really, I think 50, 60, 70, I don't know, so many authors, and it's now online, the YIVO Encyclopedia of the Jews of Eastern Europe. People cited these entries: Gordon, Yehuda Leib, that's Yalag, folklore, ethnography and anthropology, talk, blessings, curses, and other expressions, population and migration since World War I. So that means that scholars like us, when we need a quick reference that will help us go further, we go to the YIVO Encyclopedia of the Jews of Eastern Europe. Now, not everything is there because we've discovered other things, but there's a whole lot. It's 2 extraordinary volumes. Scholars in the book use the primary sources that were published at YIVO. So one of our chapters cites Yakov Shatsky, another incredible immigrant refugee scholar, his introduction to Natan Meta Hanover's Gzeras Tach, that is the Yiddish translation of the Hebrew Chronicle, and it was published in YIVO in 1938. Okay, think about that date. YIVO was still publishing in Vilna in 1938. Their scholars cited issues of the YIVO Blätter, that is the YIVO Scholarly Journal. Others cited Elias Cherikover's Geschichte von der Jiddische Arbeiterbewegung in die Vereinigten Staaten, right? The Jewish labor movement in the United States. Archival holdings of YIVO were important to this book. The archives of Yakov Leschinski, Joseph Tenenbaum, Elias Cherikover, the World Jewish Congress, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, records of the displaced person camps and centers in Austria, the United Nations UNRWA correspondence, and archives of the American Joint Distribution Committee. So that is just a little drip of what is a sea of materials at YIVO. And of course, not everything that YIVO has is comprehensive. Often you have to look for other places for some of these collections because they got scattered in the post-war period. But nonetheless, YIVO is a place to go to, and all of us benefit from it. And the book is enriched by the fact that scholars today can have access either by physically going to West 16th Street or by using the digital collections, which are incredible on their own terms. The last thing I'll mention, I'm probably ran out of time or going over my time, is Kalman Weiser's chapter. I mean, every chapter in this book is fantastic, but this book is particularly YIVO-centered because it's about a Yiddish chair in Weimar, Germany that wasn't. And it explores the relationship between Shlomo Birnbaum, the son of Nussen Birnbaum, an incredibly interesting modern Jewish ideologue who started out very much as a Yiddishist and on the left, and then became a territorialist, and then a Zionist, and then he became a devotee of Agudas Yisrael and raised his family in London as members of Agudas Yisrael, and the whole family remains really deeply committed to Haredi Judaism, but also they're all polymaths in terms of being intellectual giants, and his son Shlomo Birnbaum was an extremely important Yiddishist, and he had a relationship with someone named Heinz Kloss, which Kalman investigates in this chapter. And this had to do with getting things published in YIVO journals, whether or not Mike Sweinreich could support this chair for Yiddish in Weimar. And it's a fascinating story of Jewish and non-Jewish interactions, intellectual life, the role of Yiddish in semantic and philological studies. And of course, nothing is direct or linear in history, but tragically, we all know that the Germans, the Nazi Germans not only killed people, murdered people, but they also set out to destroy Jewish culture. And when they got to Vilna, there was an entire cadre of intellectuals hired by or organized by something called the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. And their job was to plunder Jewish libraries. And in Vilna, they found so many important archives, and including collections of the YIVO. And so that effort of intellectuals, it going so wrong under the Nazis is part of Kalman's story as well. And in the aftermath of that plunder in 46, 47, Max Weinreich, then the director of YIVO, worked tirelessly to get whatever he could out of Europe, including collections from Vilna, some of which weren't originally in YIVO's purview, if you will, but we all benefit from them now because they are here in New York, and we have access to them digitally. So YIVO functions extremely important. So I am guilty of being an institutional cheerleader, and Michael Stanislawski, though, too, benefited greatly from the linguistic training he got at YIVO and from his encounter with East European Jews who had immigrated to this country in the aftermath of the catastrophe at the Holden. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. And I hope my tech is fixed. To tell me if it's not. I want to pick up on a theme that you just mentioned, which is that the tension we do when we do history, especially involving Jewish Eastern Europe, between salvage and critique, interrogation, right? And what you've described is a powerful portrait of how much YIVO has been a place of rescuing the past, and Michael, rescuing a lost world. And yet at the same time, his job, our job as scholars, is to interrogate it, right? As I mentioned at the outset, for those of you who heard, to tear down myths and to explain critically what happens. I want to turn it over to Jonathan now and ask him to talk to us about the experience that all of us shared, the authors in this book, of studying with Michael, and how that shaped what we've ended up writing in the book, right? How that shaped us as students of history, and how that shapes us as scholars. So please take it away.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. And it's good to see my colleagues and co-editors here. And I can't see everyone out in the audience, but I'm seeing that there are quite a few of you, and that's very impressive and a worthy tribute to Michael Stanislawski and the influence that he has exerted. So in terms of training graduate students, I'm going to talk about just two things very briefly. And I'm going to kind of talk about a latter phase of graduate training first, and then an earlier phase second. And obviously central to graduate training is choosing an area of focus and choosing a dissertation topic. And what I would say about Michael, and it's true also of Yosef Yerushalmi, whom Nancy mentioned, we have to emphasize that Michael and Yosef worked hand in hand. They were a team. I just finished teaching a class, believe it or not, on the Beatles, and so they were kind of the Lennon and McCartney, you might say. And so in that sense, the metaphor is correct because their influence overlapped and is hard to untangle in some cases, especially when we were trained. But I think they agreed on some central principles. And one of them was that a dissertation should be a book. It should be not a narrowly conceived, minutely focused study of an obscure aspect of history. And I'm overstating it a little bit, but that's often how dissertations do appear in graduate studies today in history. But dissertations should be expansive. They should be capacious. They should be significant in their findings, not modifying slightly some accepted understanding of an aspect of Jewish history, but helping to reshape a field in as much as that is possible. And that's a daunting ambition for any graduate student just trying to get through, and finish the dissertation and do it successfully. But I think without that vision that the two of them instilled in their students, the legacy of both Yosef and Michael wouldn't be as great as it is. And when we look at the chapters of this volume, The Jew in the Street, I can't help holding it up because it really is quite beautiful and it feels substantial as well. It's a thick book. And it's thick and substantial, not just in quantity, but in quality and in range. Now, I think Jim alluded to the fact that we had to be selective as editors. It was a difficult challenge that we faced. Michael trained many students, many fantastic students and scholars. We decided that we just didn't have the capacity to include all of those who were worthy of being included. And so we had to effectively limit the focus to mostly the modern period and mostly Central, East Central, and Eastern Europe. And so this is just a subset of of Michael's huge influence. But at any rate, the kinds of topics that are reflected in the volume, which in a way extend from the graduate training and dissertation topics that the contributors focused on. And I should just say parenthetically that we also include some of Michael's colleagues at different institutions. It's not only graduate students, but it's primarily those who were his graduate students. The topics reflect the broad-mindedness and capacious quality of Michael's thinking. Michael is a historian who uses literature. He used it in the Yalog book. He focuses on biography. He is a social historian, especially in his Tsar Nicholas and the Jews, which is replete with statistics and analysis of history from below, from beneath. The chapters include translation, discussions of the importance of understanding translations from Hebrew to Yiddish and vice versa. These are topics that Michael paid a great deal of attention to, understanding that a translation is not simply a transmission, but is a kind of interpretive act and an ideological act, very often with an agenda. Their history of modern Jewish ideologies is an important focus of some of the chapters in the book, Zionism, socialism, and the like. This is a topic that Michael emphasized especially in his fin de siècle Zionism in the fin de siècle. And one could go on and on. Also, modern orthodoxy is something that I think perhaps was unusual in the time when Michael was training graduate students, or at least in our time, students of our vintage, to give attention and respect to the ways in which orthodoxy emerged and redefined itself and was able to mutate and adapt to become an important force in modernity itself. All of these topics and others are taken up in this volume. So it's not just a volume of tributes, as Festschrift often would be, but it really explores central themes in modern Jewish history, especially in Eastern Europe. And that's because those are the themes that Michael in his training emphasized and introduced his students to. The second thing I just want to talk about is Michael as a teacher in the classroom. And I think there's a relationship to what I just said and what Jim has also said in his introduction. And that is, it would be easy to say that Michael employed the Socratic method in the classroom. In other words, it wasn't him dictating and talking and everybody hanging on every word to write down the pearls of wisdom that he dropped. His was an interrogative process. He asked questions constantly. You were on, as a student sitting around at the seminar. And that's wonderful. And it's a method that I try to use in my own teaching, but it really doesn't get to the heart because of Michael's technique as a teacher. And I'm just going to go and say that I've benefited from many wonderful teachers in my time. But Michael, in my mind, was my greatest teacher. And I'm talking about especially in the classroom. And he wasn't necessarily a charismatic or dynamic figure. It wasn't his style, but it was the way that he made you think and why. And here I would shift from the Socratic to the Cartesian. What I mean is that Michael employed a Cartesian method, which, if you read Descartes' discourse on method, really means that Michael said, forget everything you think you know, forget everything you've heard, forget everything you've read. Let's go back to the sources and encounter them with as little baggage as possible. I think that also differentiates Michael's style as a teacher in the seminar room, and others will correct me if I'm wrong, but so often teaching graduate students today, the emphasis is on the most recent and fashionable secondary literature. And I'm not trying to put that down. I think it's necessary to know what has been written most recently and what the most recent innovations and insights are. But it wasn't really Michael's method, as far as I recall. His method was more to get his students to be able to read primary sources from the period that was being studied. And not only did this inculcate skills of reading and understanding and translation and explanation, but it also reinforce that Cartesian method of encountering the source without the intervening history of interpretation guiding what you thought. And sometimes I don't remember if Michael actually said this sentence, but I know I heard it in the movie Philadelphia starring Denzel Washington, where Denzel Washington playing a kind of uh, rough and ready lawyer combating big shot lawyers who are defending a hospital against a lawsuit would say to the jury, would say to the witness, explain it to me like I'm a 6-year-old. And I always likened that to Michael's method in the classroom. I don't mean to infantilize the process, but what I mean is don't give me a lot of highfalutin stuff, but say it plainly, and say what you're actually seeing there in the text and not some theory that you're superimposing upon it. So it's this freshness that enabled Michael and I think his students to be true revisionist historians. And that's the last thing I'm going to say. I'm going to finish off with this. You know, the term revisionist is often used in a pejorative fashion. You know, that's revisionist history, and I understand why it's used that way, and it's sometimes valid to use it that way. But Michael used to say to us, we're all, any historian worth her weight or worth her value is a revisionist historian. Because if you're just leaving things the way that you found them and making some minute modifications, you're not really doing your job. So history, the process of writing and interpreting history, is a process of renewal and rebirth, you might say, to put it in organic terms. And I think that some of that flavor comes out in the volume. I hope it does. And thank you. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you to my colleagues again and to Michael especially.
Thank you, John. And let me remind people, as you've been prompted, to put questions in the chat. If we have time, we'll certainly turn to them. Now I want to turn to Howard and ask him to speak to us a little bit about this book and the question of Europe. Right? Certainly, revisionism is important where it comes from. That's a big part of Michael's scholarship. It's one of the things we address in the book, right? And I'd love to hear Howard share some thoughts with us about Eastern Europe and Europe. What do we take from this?
Thank you, Jim, and of course, thank you to YIVO. I think I'll take an opportunity, since I am in Detroit, to shout out to Wayne State University Press that published the book. A great publisher, great to work with. So thank you all. I'm looking at the list of things I have to say, and my esteemed colleagues, listening to all their wisdom, I've been crossing things off, but you have left me a few things to say, so I'm going to be able to condense what I have to say, probably less than the time I was allotted, which is actually a good thing. So I want to speak about how Michael's sense of Eastern Europe, and I really have three things to say. First of all, he was very much involved. I think Nancy began to allude to it a little bit. He was very much involved in the reconceptualization of what Eastern Europe means from older, more narrow sense. You know, Eastern Europe, maybe meant just the lands of partitioned Poland, or in a Cold War era, that notion of East versus West. But it has broadened considerably, not only geographically, but also in terms of complexity. And so now a broader definition of Eastern Europe, it might be historically the lands between the Russian Empire and German Central Europe, or maybe even more broadly than that, the lands from the Baltics down to the Balkans. So it includes Ukraine and the lands of partition Poland and, the Pale of Settlement, these overlapping areas of Europe, but it moves beyond that as well. And Michael also, and I think this was in part that he was colleagues for many years with Istvan Dyak of blessed memory, who was very much, they were instrumental in crafting the notion of East Central Europe, which in terms of this broader notion of what Eastern Europe, the way to understand it was absolutely indispensable. And I think one of the things that reflected even this conversation today is both in Michael's work, which I'll allude to in a minute, and in the book, but also YIVO's, their Encyclopedia of Eastern Europe project. It actually has a broader East Central Europe, composition where you have many articles, for example, many articles on Hungary and the Habsburg monarchy. And this is thanks in no small part to the fact that Michael Silber was involved. But it does have this broader notion. And Michael was very much instrumental in that. And I can speak personally since I was I think I was one of his first students who worked on Hungary and the Habsburg monarchy, as opposed to, let's say, the more conventional parts of Eastern Europe. He on the one hand, he always said to me that he didn't know anything about Hungary. His knowledge of Hungary ended at Munkacs and Ungvar. That's what he said. And here I'll just pick up what Jonathan was saying about his mastery as a teacher, but repeatedly gave me great ideas about how to write about Hungary, even though he said he didn't know anything about it, which is very typical of his own humility and his own, and his own mastery as a teacher. So that's the first thing I want to say about this broader notion of Eastern Europe, which was just indispensable in understanding how to write and think about that part of the world. I think it was absolutely vital. The second thing I want to say is, and pick up what Nancy also alluded to at the beginning, is that he began working on Eastern Europe. In his first book, Tsar Nicholas, he began working before the Russian archives or the Soviet archives opened up, and he was very much aware that the materials he was working with were limited, that there was a large corpus of potential or possible information and documents that simply weren't available. And he wrote that book, and he even disclaims it in the preface to that book, that one day when the archives open up, we'll be able to have a more complete picture. Now, despite that, he still wrote a masterful book, It was one of the first books I read about the Jews of Eastern Europe when I was an undergraduate. It was a great book, but I think that he shared that excitement and enthusiasm among historians when the archives did open up, and when his students, among others, began entering these archives. What they discovered, I think it even exceeded the anticipation and the expectations. All the new material that became available. And he was very enthusiastic about being part of that broader history, or that broader range of documents that simply weren't available to him. But I think it acknowledges both his sense of limitations, but also his sense of possibilities. And moving forth, he was able to avail himself of all of that. The third thing I want to mention, the third aspect, and I think this is really in terms of how working on East Central Europe reflects his overall approach to writing history, is that, and I think Jonathan alluded to this a little bit, he was perfectly willing to blur conventional categories and conventional distinctions. It wasn't just the either or proposition of being traditional or modern, as the title of our book alludes to, but it was other sorts of categorizations: East versus West, tradition versus modernity. And beyond that, he also was willing to re-examine capstone moments without ever dismissing their importance, but reconceptualizing the before and the after. So change versus continuity was very much part of the way he operated, and very much part of the way he impressed his students, and very much woven into the fabric of this book. I'll speak personally, and then I'll give an example from the book. When I was writing about a small town in Hungary, and originally I was going to write about how this Jewish community became modern, and it just didn't work. And he said to me early on, he said, do your best, try writing this book without using the word modern at all. And the word modern I don't think it appears in the book, except maybe in the bibliography, other works, but it was absolutely vital. It was at just recognizing the fact that these dichotomies while useful in certain ways, sometimes can be limiting, and to be willing to think beyond it. And it also goes to the way one uses primary sources. Another great pearl of wisdom he gave to me. I was using some of the old Hebrew newspapers from East Central Europe as a source of information, and I was going through one with him, and I was focusing more on the news stories and the information. He said to me, "You should also look at the advertisements. That's where the real." He said, I remember, I can write a whole book just based on those advertisements. And I've done that with every newspaper ever since, a vital piece of information. Now, I think one of the essays that really reflects his willingness or his eagerness to collapse these dichotomies and to rethink capstone moments is the essay by Olga Litvak on 1881, and the essay by Leo Pinsker, Auto-Emancipation. In this way, I think Olga is very much, she's always brought her own strengths, but also wrote in the image of Michael, or used that willingness he gave us, the confidence he gave us to rethink. And like Jonathan said, it was all about revisionism, but also he always made sure you have to temper your revisionism. Though I think the phrase he used sometimes was no bashing. You can't just knock things down unless you've reread the sources, and you've constructed an alternative understanding. I think in this essay by Olga is one of the things she is able to do very, very capably, where she's looking at this seminal essay. Auto-Emancipation is really marking, in conventional Jewish historiography, the beginnings of modern Jewish politics, including Zionism and other modern phenomena. And when Olga does, and this is very Michael Stanislawski-esque, is she's looking to see influences on Pinsker from before 1881. In other words, yes, this is an important transitional moment. It's a capstone moment. It's a pivotal moment, but there's also a layer of continuity beneath this layer of seismic change. And all of these things are things that Michael imprinted on us. We're eternally grateful. It really, like Jonathan said, it was a pleasure to be a student with him. His method in the classroom, it's something that I use with my own students. I guess I would have to say that I'm a combination of Yosef Yerushalmi and Michael Stanislawski. So they had very, very different styles, and the blending and the balancing between those very different styles, I think that blending itself is very Michael Stanislawski-esque. So, I'm grateful to him, and it's also to my colleagues, and of course to YIVO. Thank you.
Thank you, Howie. I think you've question that was posed in the chat about binary. Why do we use it in the way we use it? And I think you've shown us that it's not about avoiding distinctions. It's about showing both the complexity of how words, categories, distinctions interact with one another, but also the ways in which they don't fit reality always. They don't fit the past, right? I think about A Murder in Lemberg as a book that says, wait a second, you thought there was no such thing as non-Orthodox Judaism in East Central Europe, Eastern Europe? What are you talking about? There was a huge fight over the fact that there were Jews who identified with what we might call in North America today Reform Judaism, wanted that liberal version of it, and opponents to that who defined themselves against it. Another way we could talk about this is going to be obvious to everyone here who is a YIVO Nick, which is that Eastern Europe doesn't stop at the borders of even Europe, right? And I think to our book, and Nancy's contribution is a great example that the Yiddish world is a world that well before the Shoah extends across continents, and certainly after continues as a different kind of cultural phenomenon. A lot of our essays reflect that, and that can also be traced to, the Yalog biography, in which he talks about at the end, the idea that trends that we see in modern North American life can be seen as extensions, things that began in Eastern Europe. Just that was then, and now there's something after, right? So in that vein, as we come to close to the end of our time, I want to ask each of you to take a stab at thinking about what does this book mean in terms of this terrible phrase, historical for today.
We live in a world. You fell out, Jim. Historical what?
What was the terrible phrase?
Okay, sorry. I'll finish quickly. Historical lessons.
Oh, historical lessons.
We live in a world which, so much is being, we are in conflict as a Jewish community about some of our core commitments, and how to respond to anti-Semitism, how to think about the memory of the Shoah, how to think about Israel, and all of these things. So what do each of you, I don't know who wants to jump in, maybe Nancy, and say what you think this book does. How does it speak to our moment, given that we wrote it and published it in a moment of real change and conflict?
Oh my. Well, I don't think history teaches lessons. And I make it very clear to my students. What history teaches us, and it sounds a little perhaps too psychological for everyone, but it helps you understand where we are now. We, meaning if you want the Jewish community, we people living in 2024, in our case, we North Americans, Americans and not Canadians or Mexicans. So history is the best way to understand, and also to understand that what you assume to have been static is not static. And any good historian, and this sort of playing with this idea of revisionism, knows that, you write history from where you stand, and that changes. And therefore, that's why we can revisit materials in the past, like Olga Litvak rereading auto-emancipation and rethinking, for example, conscription and induction into the Russian army, thinking about, just take an example from when we're writing, thinking about that, and you were an American, when conscription was mandatory, you would have one view of the army, then someone post 71, I don't get the date wrong, when there's no longer mandatory army in the United States, right? It's going to shift your attitude as a citizen towards the army. So all that is what any good book of history does. And I think the chapters in this book all engage really kind of profound questions. I mean, the Yiddish language, where it went, what it meant, and what it meant in Mendoza, Argentina, or what it meant in the Soviet Union. The post-war period, another important contribution. We tend to think that the Holben or the show. I'm having a hard time these days with this terminology. I'm now adopting the destruction of European Jewry, as opposed to these one-off Shoah or Holben, which get, like, I don't know, reified. The Jewish community in Europe was destroyed catastrophically, horrendously, let's say it what it was. But the post-war period wasn't just ashes, even though it was horrible. But Gil Rubin's piece shows that there was a lot of conversation about where the Jews going to live, what's more important, what is our attitude towards the settlement project, or migration to Eretz Israel or mandatory Palestine, all those things. So I think the book, I wouldn't say lessons. I just don't think there are lessons. The human condition is so complicated, and we rethink ourselves all the time. But it does help people understand. It does help people understand where we are now. And again, I know other people want to say something, but the introduction that you, John, wrote really also helps people understand, if they care about these things, the moment of writing history at Columbia University, when there weren't that many programs. There were, if you wanted to be an historian of the Jews, there weren't that many programs when we were coming of age, right? And now there are lots. And the students of Todd Endelman and Deborah Dashmore and Ismar Shorsh and went out all over the country because of chairs and other opportunities, and really began to teach. But we're now experiencing a contraction of that for a whole host of complicated reasons, the most of which is the economics of the higher ed. So I think the book reflects a kind of, in some ways, a golden age of, and I don't like that word very much, but a real incredible moment when you had really solid cohorts at Columbia, at Harvard, and a few other places, which produced a community of scholars. And that doesn't answer the lessons question, but that's what the book embodies, I think, in a lot of ways.
Thank you, Nancy. John or Howie, anything you want to share for non-lessons or insights?
John, you go first.
Okay, thank you.
We're going to go in chronological order of when we got to Columbia.
Right. Yeah, I agree with Nancy that that history doesn't exactly have lessons in the way that it's conventionally understood. But one thing that, and I agree with her, and I think what she was saying is that uh, history teaches us that things were different in the past, and therefore they can be different in the future. That we're not living in an eternal present. That's important. I think it's very important for undergraduates to understand, because they're young, and it would be totally natural for them to assume that the bad things won't change and they won't get better, and that's not a good message for a teacher to convey. And you don't want to be Pollyannish, but you also want to encourage students' hopes. Um, but I'm also going to cite Gil Rubin's essay on the post-war because what it so brilliantly, I think, elucidates is how uh, uh, spokespeople, observers, scholars, sociologists, political leaders misunderstood the present, very often misunderstood the present. And when they tried to project into the future, they got it very wrong. Um, I'll have to cite another favorite historian in addition to Michael Stanislawski. It was Lawrence Levine, who wrote a book called The Unpredictable Past. That the past is extraordinarily surprising. The past can't really tell us much about the future, despite the efforts of of people like Marx and lesser lights to assume that the course of history was laid out. That was always something opposed to what we might call teleological historiography, thinking that there's a path that history reveals, that if we just look for the signs, we can decode and discover. At the same time, one perhaps, I don't know, one note that maybe for me marks a difference in time between when I was a graduate student and when I experienced Michael's fantastic training and now is that to me at least, that my experience was Michael had the effect of disillusioning me from a lot of the illusions that I had entertained, romantic and otherwise, about the Jewish past and about questioning. He enabled me to question many of the assumptions, some of them very precious to me, that I had to give up. And I think that's absolutely a worthwhile kind of training that a teacher can provide. But I sometimes wonder today if we've gone too far in that direction, and that it's as I said at the beginning, it's important to enable students to believe in things, to believe in possibilities. I don't think Michael was ever discouraging anybody from that, but I wonder if the pedagogy of skepticism sometimes overwhelms the field. And it's necessary. However, I don't know how this could be accomplished, but it's necessary to combat it a little bit and look for possibilities of believing in a future, of attaining hope. Things seem often so bleak, and yet we mustn't settle for that. If history teaches anything, I'll just go back to the last remark. I know I'm rambling on, but I'll go back to the first remark. Things can be different. And we're not stuck with the status quo, and that's not just a scary thought, but it's an inspiring thought.
I would just add to what Nancy and John said. I'm used to this. When I started at Columbia, they were already there for a year, and I had to get used to the fact that I was just never going to be the smartest person in that program. It's just a fact of life. But what I'll add to what they said so nicely is that, binaries are useful. They're a useful point of departure, especially for undergraduates to organizing thoughts, and they only become problematic when they become an end in and of itself. When they preclude more complex thinking. And one of the essential core in the way Michael trained us is he would use terms not just messy, but mishmash of ideas and hodgepodge, especially when you dive into places like East Central Europe. A lot of those binaries don't work. and may be useful to a point, but you have to be willing to think beyond them. You have to be willing to really take on the messiness of history and not be frustrated or disappointed where there isn't going to be a simple answer. In fact, I think in terms of its application now, you know, there are a lot of things we deal with right now, as always, where a one-dimensional approach to the problem, regardless of what the one dimension is simply inadequate. Complex thinking, complexity, nuance, perspective, context, background. That's what Michael really drilled into us. And I agree also, John, in terms of that notion, he was the quintessential skeptic, but at the same time, he also made sure to provide the tools to overcome the skepticism by being able to rebuild not only a new approach, but a more complex approach. And that what you mentioned about going back to the sources, that was a nice complement to you begin with a mentality or approach of skepticism, but you don't stop there. You use the tools to go back and rebuild something which helps you move beyond the skepticism.
Thank you, Howard. Well,
I just had one little piece about, because I know we're going to close up, but there was a in the chat, that whole question of binary and the problem of the term, and I think the person was reacting to it. Another way to think about binary is dichotomies or rigid distinctions. And Howard, I think you'll remember, I think we were both in the class that Professor Stanislawski called traditional responses to modernity. And it like twisted our head up, because those traditional responses, or what he termed traditional, were in fact what many of us had already imbibed were modern responses, like the Jewish Enlightenment or reform aspects of Reform Judaism. So I think that, again, to respond to the person's skepticism about our use of the term, history is just complicated, and we use terminology heuristically, and then we say, let's throw it out. There's just no way to organize yourself otherwise. So yeah, tradition and modernity are terms we all use. Maybe Howard didn't use them in his book, but I don't know how he managed that. I've used them, but then you have to say, what do you actually mean by tradition? Is this tradition that shaped in, today in 2024 in Borough Park, or is this tradition, it was Samson Raphael Hirsch, or was it tradition of the Baal Shem Tov? I mean, whose tradition is it? And the same thing with this idea of modernity. So we do use binaries or dichotomies as vehicles to show the complexity of the past. So I think, and when Howard and I sat in the class, traditional responses to modernity, that was just, again, an exemplified Michael's method. Sorry, Jim.
No, thanks, Nancy.
I definitely used the word modernity when I alluded to that course in my book, Traditional Responses to Modernity, because it has defined.
I was going to call you on that because I saw that.
Absolutely right, because it has defined everything I have done since.
So we hope you will read the book. We've enjoyed talking about it. We hope you'll read the book, and we hope you'll read Michael Stanislawski's book as well. If this is an introduction to our new work, it's also a celebration of his work. Many classics that he has written, and he continues to write. So we are grateful that this is a celebration of a scholar who is still teaching and still working and contributing. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
And maybe visit YIVO too.